I got interested in this fruit in the late 80s when in Emeryville, I found some large tree and I thought I knew about fruit trees and I sort of thought I knew what different fruits were. And I didn't know what the heck this was. And I saw that raccoons and rats were chomping on the fruit. And so I lived dangerously, ate some of the fruit and survived. Um, and that was my introduction to white sapotes. And I learned about this tree early on from folks like Bob Chambers in Southern California and Paul Thompson. Both those guys have passed away. Locally in Santa Cruz, Rick McCain was quite a sort of a white sapote pioneer, I think. And he had lots of useful thoughts and info for me, back when I was trying to learn about this fruit. Now, I'm kind of a Luddite. It's hard for me to deal with things like Zoom, so you'll have to bear with me. I was in fact quite scared to give this presentation because a fellow by the name of Reed told me I should do it, and he said it should be an illustrated talk on fruit. Now, I thought this would be an illustrated lecture, but anyway, so I'm a little bit primitive. Let's move on past that bad joke. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to go on a Sapote safari, and we're going to talk about botany, some other information, a little bit of chemistry, nothing too scary. We're going to talk about how to grow this fruit. We'll talk a little bit about different varieties of the fruit. But that's kind of our roadmap of what we'll try to do. The other important roadmap info is I'm going to ride my bike across the Sierras tomorrow. So I'm going to bail out of here in about an hour and 15 minutes. So unfortunately, I've got a hard time that I've got to finish tonight. But Carol suggested that if people had email questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and she could share with folks. So let's talk a little bit about white sapote. It's in the citrus family, the Rutaceae. Casamaroa edulis is the Latin name for this fruit. And sapotes are a little tricky because sapote is a word that's given to many, many different things. And that sort of etymological confusion stems from early Spanish invasion of the Americas and the fact that Nahuatl, the Nahuatl word sapote means soft, sweet fruit. And so sapotes are not related, white sapotes are not related to things like true sapotes in the Sapotaceae family, things like Lucuma, Canistel, Sapote verde, Chico sapote. They're also not related to Sapote negro, the chocolate pudding fruit, persimmon. So it's a little tricky, but when we say white sapote, we mean Casamaroa edulis. It's hard to tell that it's in the citrus family. The one kind of clue is if you eat the fruit, the seed looks dead on a big orange or lemon seed. A couple of other species, also New World species, that we won't really talk about. Casamaroa tetrameria, sometimes called the woolly leaf sapote. Some people would classify this as a subspecies of edulis. I don't really like this as a fruit. I think white sapote is much nicer than the woolly leaf sapote. There's some things that people think are woolly leaf sapotes, or I hear them called woolly leaf sapotes in California, and I would argue they're really not. Tetrameria has like a very hairy, sort of fuzzy underside. It's a fruit that kind of tastes like turpentine to me. You sort of smell it on people's breaths. So we're not going to talk about that. There's very few of them around. There are some I've seen in the U.S., not just further south. That Tetrameria generally goes further south into Central America. And a slightly northern species, Casamaroa pringli, sort of centered around Monterey in Mexico, so kind of northern Mexico, actually goes up into Texas. And that really is something that somebody younger than me should do a little bit of hybridization on. Cold hardiness is not an issue for me, but that's sort of an intriguing thing that folks should work with. Generally, the fruits are smaller. So thing we're going to talk about, white sapote, native to the highlands of Mexico. This is not a tropical lowland fruit. Goes south into through Central America, down through Guatemala, all the way into Costa Rica, but not in the tropical lowlands. And it's been around in California for a long time. The missions dragged it in with them. So it's been here for a couple of 100 years. And it's certainly something that the CRFG folks have had a lot of interest in, as has the USDA. So let's do, pardon me while I change slides. So this is a subtropical evergreen. It's got palmate compound leaves, typically 5 leaflets on hand. And 5 is kind of a magic number for this species. It does a lot of things in 5s. Like, it's sort of astonishing. It's kind of like it's really its magic number. They do drop their leaves if they get stressed. So don't be alarmed if your tree like drops all of its leaves. It's not necessarily dead. In fact, it probably isn't. Scratch the bark to see if you've got green cambium. They drop their leaves in response to heat, like a big heat wave coming through. If all of a sudden it's been moderate and you get a heat wave, they drop their leaves in response to drought stress. They drop their leaves if it gets really cold, like, you know, really bad freezing temps, they can drop it. The new growth is attractive. It's reddish. The flowers are not particularly ornamental. They're relatively small. So white sapotes can get quite big. This is a fruit that I've traveled like south of the border to look at and try and, you know, find trees. And when they're ungrafted, they can get maybe as tall as 75 feet. Here's a big ungrafted tree. I'm trusting that everybody can see this. I do hope that's the case. I guess that seems a disadvantage of Zoom. Am I just talking to myself here? Hopefully. All right, great. Carol has told me, yes, things are working. That's good, thank you. Big old trees get these buttress trunks. You can kind of see that on the one behind here. That's an old tree that was on George Emmerich's property in northern San Diego County. Doran and I did some fruit expedition at some point down south. But the good news for you, if you want to grow one, grafted trees tend to stay a lot smaller. And here is a tree that was 25 years old when this photo was taken, down in Mexico. And this is typical of a lot of grafted trees. They do vary in terms of their vigor by variety quite a bit. I've seen some seedlings that have genetic defects where they're prostrate. Essentially, they don't really grow up. They're almost a ground cover, which is pretty weird. But grafted trees are relatively easy to control. And like my hair, you know, you just get out your scissors and keep them to a manageable size. One question that I get a lot is, can I grow my white sapote in a pot? Please, please. And there's a lot of things in life that we can do, but maybe we shouldn't. Don't grow your white sapote in a pot. It's just not a good long-term thing to do. They've got a nice deep taproot, great big extensive feeder root network. They do much, much better in the ground, much easier to care for, much healthier. Potted trees don't tend to do well, especially in the long run. So not a good choice for growing in a pot. I'm trying to get it down. So here's I've got a picture here on the screen of a relatively young tree. This is a street tree in Berkeley. And this tree, I think, this might be 5 years old. If Bharath is on this chat or this conversation, he could tell you. I'm trying to remember. It's probably about 5 years old. This is very typical of a young white sapote. Long, gangly, upright growth when they're young. And hang on while I experience technical difficulties. Let me mute myself. All right, hey, I'm back. Sorry about that. This is what they tend to look like as they get older. It's very typical for them to have an umbrella shape. Those long upright limbs tend to flop down. And that's sort of characteristic umbrella shape with age. And somebody's asked, can you treat them like apples? Not really. They're not nearly as manageable with pruning as apples. With apples, it's very easy to direct growth. You can nick, you can notch, you can exfoliate them very easy, which is a sign they're very docile creatures. Sapotes are not a docile creature. Much harder to control. If you cut back some of those long, gangly limbs, often it'll throw 5 new shoots to replace it. You can, of course, bend down limbs. They'll bend down naturally with fruit and time, but you can bend them down. You can pinch out the terminal bud to get them to try to force branching. Wow, we're getting lots of questions. How should we do this? Do they handle salty, windy stuff? I don't know about salt. Wind is not so bad. They're much better in wind than some other things like avocados. Do they fruit on old wood, on new wood? Somebody has asked. Both, actually. We'll see some slides. They'll actually sometimes make fruit on the stem, like a jaboticaba. They exhibit cauliflory. But primarily, the flowers are born both axillary and terminal panicles, I would say. But we should probably keep rolling and maybe try to do questions at the end.
Yeah, Tom, so typically in our group, what people do is they go ahead and they type in their questions when they occur. And you can just keep rolling and we'll just answer as many as we can at the end.
Okay.
Okay, so
sounds good.
You know, people, it's stream of consciousness, so we'll keep on streaming, you keep on rolling.
Okay. Okay. So are there any minors present on this call tonight? I hope not, or I hope they got parental permission to be here because we're going to talk about sex. Sorry about that. So let's talk about flowers. Here's some white sapote flowers. The flowers do vary. Some are perfect flowers, but some are not. There have been some studies some academics done sort of trying to figure out what's going on, how self-fertile are they? And it does vary for sure by variety, but in general, many tend to be self-fertile, especially of the named cultivars. Tons of seedling white sapotes have all sorts of problems. Some are female only, some are male only, some have all sorts of flower defects, will never make fruit. But named varieties in general tend to be self-fertile. But that's certainly something that a fair bit more work really could and should be done at. Pollinators, bees like them, but plenty of both European honeybees, but plenty of native bees, and also some flies work the flowers. This slide, I can see those leaves in the background, that leaf pubescence, that fuzziness on the underside of the leaf, that's a classic indicator that this is a picture of Subel. We'll talk about varieties later. Subel is the most commonly available variety in California, and it's one that I never recommend to people for reasons we'll talk about. I always encourage people to plant something other than Subel. So Sapotes want to make fruit. They make a lot of fruit. There was one study done by some academic. I didn't think it was a particularly good study, but he did some calculations that per acre, white sapotes make more calories than anything else, which seemed like sort of ridiculous in a lot of ways. But the sort of general point really is pretty fair, and that's that you can get a lot of fruit off this tree. That I think is a good thing. There's a variety called chestnut that the parent tree in 1971 made 3,000 pounds of fruit. So, you know, productive. This is a picture of a variety, a seedling of mine that I've called Moran. I think that photo is maybe 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old. In general, here in Northern California, like so many fruits, our sort of crop timing is retarded behind what it is in Southern California. You know, in SoCal, kind of early white sapotes might come in late summer, August, and they're sort of done by maybe December or January. Here we're quite a bit delayed, at least in my climate. I would say an important thing though as I talk is to realize that my climate is quite cool. It's a coastal bay climate in the fog zone of the Golden Gate. I live in a town called El Cerrito, and we don't have a lot of heat. We have, you know, it's hard to grow many yellow peach varieties or astringent here. You know, big tomatoes mostly are abject failures here. Things like cherry tomatoes are fine. You know, sort of classic heat indicators. Things like true guavas are a total bust here. There's not the heat for them. So that will color my remarks. Although this is, you know, I'll also try to give hope to folks who live in very different climates, because you can grow this fruit pretty darn much almost anywhere in California. Like many fruits, they can be quite alternate. That does vary a bit by variety. Some are really much more everbearing. You know, I've got enough varieties and enough trees that I really can eat a sapote any day of the year. What is this, May, late May? I just harvested and sold a bunch of fruit like, you know, last week. So the heavy window here for us, I would argue, is kind of late fall into March. And let's try to move on. let's talk about size of the fruits. These are fruits in Santa Cruz County. That's a McDill. McDill is a big fat fruit. It's the second most widely available fruit that's sold by nurseries, the first being Sue Bell. McDill does make very large fruit. Is it the absolute biggest? It's hard to say, but a really big Sapote would be 5 inches. I think I've, once out of seeing, eating hundreds of different varieties and seedlings, I've seen one that was 5.5 inches once. But typically they're kind of between the size of a golf ball and an orange. And they do vary somewhat by variety. But again, heavy yields, right? This is a good tree if you're hungry. I'm always hungry, so I like this fruit. There's some disadvantages to having a heavy set, right? Don't plant these over your driveway. Even if you're really hungry, it's hard to keep up. The fruits do go bad quickly when they hit the ground. They quickly produce alcohol. They ferment very readily, which some people are excited about, people who like to make wine. But just be aware the fruit can be messy. They're tremendously diverse, I would argue, in what they look like. And they're diverse in a couple of ways. Here are some sort of different shapes of fruit and some colors. Some fruits, when they're dead ripe, are dark green. And typically those tend to be quite white or pale on the inside. Often the greener the fruit on the outside when it's ripe, often maybe the plainer or the simpler the flavor profile. Some ones that tend to be quite white, quite green outside, dead white inside, tend to be a little sort of sweet, but not a lot of complex flavor notes. But they also can go quite yellow on the outside, and the more yellow they are on the outside, the kind of more creamy or khaki color they can get on the inside. They can get sugar spots on the inside, which are always delectable. And they vary a lot in terms of shapes. Some are sort of pointy nippled, some are recessed on the flower end. Some are lopsided, the attachment point is to the side. Some are round, some look like a manila mango. They're sort of recurved like a paisley. They can go all the way in color to deep orange, actually, although that's much less common. And another way that they vary, and this is really important, and this is like the thing that I always tell people and has a hard time getting through, but they vary tremendously in flavor. You can pick 2 fruits next to each other on the same tree, both sort of having equal sun exposure. Eat one and eat the other one, and it's like you're eating two different varieties. Apples, or many things that we eat, you eat one and it's like a Braeburn apple, you know what you're getting. Sapotes are not like that. They're much, much more diverse, including ripe fruits the same day, the same tree. And so that's why I'm always a little skeptical when people say, oh, this is the best white Sapote ever. And I bet it was that day for that person, but they're more diverse, I think, than often people suspect or realize. Like here's the box, different white Sapotes, sort of showing you, a little bit of that diversity. So everybody loves Sapotes. there are ones that are better than others. There are ones that are maybe not quite as good if you're, if you think, you're particularly fond of a particular variety. But the good news is this is a fruit that just about everybody enjoys. Dole did a series of focus groups with consumers, American consumers in the 70s on unusual fruits. Think back to the 70s. What were we eating then? I don't know, maybe you guys had had tastier things, but it was kind of like white bread and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches for me, and fruits were basically apples or bananas or oranges, kind of. So we got a lot more options today, but Dole did a huge set of focus groups with lots and lots of, especially subtropical fruits, but sort of fruits that were not in the mainstream American produce aisle. And white sapotes had the highest taste acceptance of anything they tested. That's a good sign. So let's think a little bit more. Flavor is kind of an important thing. We should talk about what do they taste like? People say caramel flan or vanilla pear or all sorts of things. They do vary in taste, and there are definitely variations with variety for sure. One important thing is that when the fruits are overripe or bruised, or based on where they're grown, they can have quite a bitter flavor to them. Kind of a quinine-like flavor is maybe a way to describe it. And almost all of that, if the fruit is not bruised, is in the skin. So you could theoretically peel them if that bugs you. But, easier said than done. The thickness of the skin varies quite a bit. The challenge with this fruit commercially is that the skin tends to be paper thin. They tend to bruise quite easily. But some varieties really have quite thick skins. The ones that have thick skins will often hang on the fruit even after hang on the tree even after they're ripe. And so bruising is a real issue, handling. They have been shipped to the East Coast. And, that was before we were moving much more perishable things around, stuff that gets moved around today. There really is a range of flavors in this fruit. Some of them have a nice, what I would call a lemony flavor. There's definitely caramel flavors in some. There's some that taste like pumpkin pie filling, the stuff you buy in a can. There's definitely like meringue, egg white kind of flavor. There was even one that sadly is lost today that had a lovely coconut flavor that I searched for unsuccessfully for far too long. So do you need heat to ripen this fruit, right? A lot of our fruits that we grow really get higher Brix, better flavor in a hotter climate. Well, I've got good news. If you don't have a hot climate, this fruit can make excellent fruit in a relatively low heat climate. I don't have a lot of heat. I find that the flavor on my fruit is excellent. The advantage of a low heat climate, of course, for sapotes and anything else really, is that fruit can hang much longer. So if you're growing a given citrus variety in Bakersfield versus in Santa Cruz, you can harvest that variety for a much longer window in Santa Cruz than in Bakersfield. And frankly, I think that's a great thing for backyard growers. And let's talk a little bit about that bitter flavor. There was one really interesting study out of Israel. Israel is a producer of this fruit. Bob Chambers supplied them with science, as well as a bunch of other places, including some countries in Africa, experiment stations, including Japan. And this one study in Israel had identical growers, the exact same varieties, but the difference really was the water the trees were getting. One was getting high sodium groundwater, the other was getting surface water, low sodium, higher calcium water. And the higher sodium water grows had distinctly more bitter fruit. So that, I think, is quite an interesting thing to be aware of. Think a little bit about what you're using to water them. Nobody really followed that up academically. Chemistry. Wow, we're going back to college or high school now. Organic chemistry. One thing that is interesting about this fruit is that the sugars here are 5-membered rings, as opposed to more common 6-membered rings. So that's good from a glycemic index perspective, I think. It's not something that anybody has really tried to market. It's not something that anybody's looked at, but it's certainly intriguing. Sapotes are low in fat, relatively high in vitamin C. Maybe the most interesting thing about this fruit chemically is that it's got a compound in it called casamyrosine. And that has been studied for quite some time. And it is the reason that you shouldn't eat seeds of this fruit. Like raw seeds will kill you, actually. They'll also kill roaches, popular home pest control remedy in parts of the world where it's from. But that compound is present through the whole fruit. It's also present in the leaves, in the bark, in the seeds, most present in the seeds. If you make a tea of the leaves, and if you travel in Mexico, like every little village apothecary has got dried white sapote leaves, and people use them in sort of a steeped concoction as a blood pressure tea. And that's been looked at, studied, proven conclusively to lower blood pressure. And that's why if you eat the seeds, you'll die. It lowers it too much, all the way down, you're dead. We wouldn't talk about roasting seeds and exotic, scary things, but people do all sorts of things. So let's keep rolling in the interest of time, because I know you will have questions. Let's talk about pests. So this is a pretty easy tree to grow, and to grow organically. The biggest pest is really scale. Ants will form scale on the tree. It's one of the reasons that I'm not keen on varieties like Subel that have fuzzy leaf undersides. Scale really likes that more. So control the ants, tanglefoot, skirt the trees up to control the scale. Scale isn't usually bad enough to kill trees, but it just sort of makes a sooty honeydew mess. It's not pleasant. When you're picking fruit, you end up with lots of like ants running all over your head. Snails will strip the leaves, especially. It's not really a problem on big trees, but on young trees, especially if you just grafted one, like snail crawls up in there and munches all the new growth, or slugs, like, oops, you lost that's not good. So you can control for snails, sort of however you like, lots of ways. Squirrels like the fruit, rats like the fruit. I'm a huge believer in the Wildlife Control Supplies tubular squirrel trap. Very effective. In fact, I disposed of 2 squirrels earlier today. Oops, sorry. I hope that doesn't offend our vegetarian friends. But squirrels and rats will really do a number on the fruit, and it's a problem because they'll, take bites out before they're ripe. And things like avocados, if a squirrel takes a bite, will heal themselves. And it's not a problem for eating the fruit. It is a problem for sapotes; they'll rot. So control those rodents. Deer, Deer will eat this fruit. It's not their favorite leaf, but they'll definitely do a number on it, especially if they're hungry. There are various ways of controlling your deer. I will let you use your imagination. And in general, these trees are really good at getting the nutrition they need from the soil, as well, frankly, as the water. So you can apply like citrus fertilizer if they look like they're missing some micronutrient, if you've got some weird sort of looking leaves or something. But frankly, they tend to be pretty healthy on their own. Really easy to grow organically, I would say. Here, yeah, let's say that. Let's move on. Let's see what I've got for the next slide. Okay, so here's a nice grove of white sapotes in Southern California. They like a sunny exposure. You know, like so many things we grow, you're not going to do best at fruit production and getting flowers if your tree is in the shade all day. You really won't. The good news is that they're incredibly adaptable. They are subtropical. So we can like grow these as far north as Chico, California. The feds, the USDA had an experiment station at Chico, which is now no more. And that experiment station had a white sapote collection. This is kind of early 1900s. And, you know, Chico's pretty cold. And you can grow them in pretty hot interior climates as well. So they're really quite adaptable. You couldn't grow them, you know, at 6,000 feet in the Sierras. Somebody should prove me wrong. They're basically as hardy as a sweet orange. So they're tougher than true lemons. They're probably a little tougher than a fuerte avocado. But they're not as hardy, say, as, like a Mexicola avocado. So that gives you some idea. Of course, the older they are, the bigger they are, the tougher they are, the more cold-hearted they are, like anything else. In my climate, I haven't seen freeze damage on probably any trees here, I bet in 20 years. I have seen freeze damage here on white sapotes, but it's been a long time. Let's think other stuff. Some can take a long time to come into bearing. Well, first of all, obviously seedlings take a long time compared to grafted trees to bear fruit, right? Put sexually mature wood on the tree, like sapotes, like anything else, will bear faster. My best seedling of all the seedlings that I've fruited, by far the one, you know, I've fruited maybe a couple dozen from seed. And my best one took 21 years before it bore fruit. So, you know, patience is a virtue. But like the talking heads say, patience is a virtue, but I don't have much time. So graft your trees, people. Good idea. Some varieties are very precocious. Some will fruit like in a little pot when you graft them, and others can take quite a while. Subel often can take a while. I've seen some Subel trees take 12 years before they bear. Yikes. One of my favorite white sapotes ever, like my kind of a personal favorite, a variety called Walton, which I love, takes a while to come into bearing because it's quite vigorous. It wants to make vegetative growth early instead of fruiting. So let's think other thoughts about growing them. We should really talk about horticulture. The best time to plant a white sapote, I'm sure that question will be asked. Well, of course, the answer is 20 years ago. But the next best time is today. If you have rootstock that is flushing new growth and you've got some scion wood. I've grafted this tree successfully 12 months, every month of the year. I do have a mild climate, and there's enough growth pushes, that you can usually find a tree that's undergoing a growth push and graft it. They're highly variable from seed, and this is an important thing. Everybody, this is a question that I'm sure will be asked. If I grow a seedling, will it be a good fruit? And it's hard to say, but here's how I answer that question. Having eaten lots and lots of seedlings all over the place, I don't play the lottery with gambling, but it is fun with fruiting plants. So I like to plant seedlings. Typically, I'll leave an ungrafted branch and graft onto it, and that often will make the seedling branch fruit earlier. But from seed, I would say that you have the following breakdown in terms of odds. 25% of fruits from seed will be about as good as a name variety, that kind of level of good. 25% will be decent, like edible, maybe not as good as a name variety, but like something you could eat and most people might get some pleasure from. So about 50% have edible fruit. About 25% from seed will have like no fruit, like various flower defects. They just won't fruit. Maybe there'll be only male flowers. The female flower will have some problem. And about 25% will make really lousy fruit, like really bitter, small, kind of nasty fruit. So that's how I would try to answer that question. Let's go on. Okay, so let's talk about different varieties, because people always, because this is the CRFG, of course, people are very interested in different varieties and what's the best variety ever. And so I think that's a hard question to answer because I don't know your taste buds. But, I think I've done maybe a dozen taste testings of this fruit, like, organized, and we did a bunch of them blind. And at some point in the past, some of those were written up in the Golden Gate chapter newsletters. There's also been taste test results in the Fruit Gardener. And one thing I always notice is that different varieties seem to win every taste testing. And part of that, the real message is here, these taste tests don't really mean much. I really don't sort of put much personal stake in them at all. So much depends on the individual fruit that was picked, how specifically ripe it was. When these fruits get overripe, they suck. And if they're underripe, like, they're basically inedible. So what I'm going to give you is sort of my own thoughts on different varieties. And the bottom line is that there's lots of good white Sapotes, and most name varieties you're going to enjoy. A little bit about my own sort of taste, sort of biases with this fruit. I don't like the really bland ones nearly as much as I like ones that are a little more complex in flavor. I like what I call the lemony flavors, or the sort of caramel flavors in this fruit, ones that have more of that. A little tiny bit of bitterness to me isn't a bad thing. It sort of gives it a little bit richer, more interesting flavor. So that's my own kind of bias. I think I'm going too slowly. We're going to have to speed this up. I'm sorry. I will try to be more speedy. Okay, so Rainbow is a variety that has been in Santa Cruz County since at least the 80s, maybe the 70s, maybe the 80s. And it's one of the best tasting white Sapotes ever. I think it's delicious as a fruit. It's complex flavor, lemony, yummy. Big disadvantage, it doesn't make a lot of fruit. But the fruit you get is delicious. And that seems to be true wherever I've seen rainbow grown, on my own trees, on multiple different trees. This is a tree that I have a lot of trees of. I'm embarrassed to say I don't even know how many, but it's far too many. So, oh, and something else I should probably mention. I'm not like some aristocrat with like huge quantities of land. I grow stuff about close to a dozen different locations, a lot of people's backyards. I'm farming a bunch of different places. So it's also true in Southern California. It's a little bit too shy yielding. So we're gonna move on. What's our next variety? The fabled Golden Globe. Bob Chambers really like this variety. It's quite good. It's a very round fruit. It's sort of a pale yellow. It's not quite as rich in flavor as maybe I would like. The fruit is not big, tends to be a little small, decent production. This stuff I should really just try to keep rolling through, and because we're gonna have a lot of questions, I'm sure. What do we have here? Lemon gold. So lemon gold. Oh, are we on lemon gold? Huh, that's all right. Never mind. Technical difficulties. Lemon gold is the one that, if you read old CRFG articles for fun, which is something that you all should do, you can. I bet they're. I don't know where they're all available. But they used to be available at libraries, ag libraries, like UCSC or UC Berkeley, Striving Arboretum. You'll see that Bob Chambers thought that lemon gold was the one that folks should grow. It had the best combination of attributes. I love the flavor. I've got a big old lemon gold tree in a great location. You know, I think it's at least 20 years old. It just doesn't make enough fruit to me to be worth it. But it is a nice fruit, not the best tasting ever. Malibu number 3, that's a worthy fruit. One thing that I like about it is it's got a thick skin, which is nice for reducing bruising. Now this fruit is a personal favorite, and I've kind of evangelized this fruit for quite a while. Walton, I think, I've never eaten a sapote that I think is better tasting. So I think it's right up there at the very top for flavor. I find it to be very productive. And fruit is good size, decent size fruit. It can be quite big, setting like a huge crop right now. The disadvantage of it, and I think there really is only one, is that it's vegetatively vigorous. So it doesn't want to be a super tiny tree, and it wants to grow for a bit before it fruits. Bear with me. Okay, so here's a list of some that you might see out there. And it's got two on it that I always recommend to people. I sell like grafted trees to people, and I've been distributing cyanwood at CRFG exchanges for a very long time now. I think 20 years or something. But Vernon and Nettie are great choices if you're going to have one tree. They're both very productive, quite precocious, relatively small trees, easier to keep sort of under control, and they make a very tasty fruit. Nettie is pretty ever-bearing, a little bit wider spread than quite a few others. Vernon is a nice long harvest window too. And both of those are really worthy fruits. And if you're going to have one tree, like I always recommend grow a Vernon or grow a Nettie. Chestnut is a big fruit. It's a kind of pear-shaped, large fruit. it's decent. It's an interesting flavor. Maybe not quite as rich as I would like, but quite good. Some years it really is doesn't make anything. It does tend to be maybe more alternate. Cuccio is quite productive, also precocious. A nice choice. Somebody asked, do they fruit on new growth or old growth? Look at those fruits. That's like netty fruit growing right out of the trunk. That's not super common, but that does happen. And that's actually a characteristic netty shape. Netty tends to have a pointed fruit. The seeds are also pointed inside, but tends to have quite a long sort of protruding nipple on the bottom. Cuccio, nice round fruit, not the tastiest ever, pretty decent. But it occurs to me that this is the Monterey Bay, CRFG. We should mention the fabled Santa Cruz fruit. Probably some of you are growing Santa Cruz. Here's sort of my take on Santa Cruz. This is a somewhat heretical view. I'm sorry to be not just overall. Santa Cruz is a nice fruit. It's a decent fruit. It's productive. It's reasonably fertile. I don't think it's the tastiest fruit ever, but it is a seedling tree in Santa Cruz County. Very big leaves on Santa Cruz. That's one kind of distinguishing feature. For a while, a friend of mine was kind of hyping Santa Cruz as the best white Sapote for Northern California or stuff like that. To me, in flavor, it's decent, but it's totally middle of the road. It's not like at all like an absolutely, oh my God, kind of fruit. Here's a bunch of ones that are maybe, less grown. I was sort of distributing a lot of this wood at different points in the past. Oh, actually, I'll mention one on here. I'll show you some pictures in this slideshow of a fruit called Moran, and that's a seedling of mine that I quite like. That's the best of all the seedlings I've grown out. That's the best. It's productive. It's a big fruit, and it's quite tasty, I think. So I'm a fan of Moran. Reineke Commercial is a fun fruit. It looks like a heirloom tomato, flattened, deep orange, not yellow, but really deep orange. Pretty cool to see that, and not worth growing to me. Doesn't make enough fruit. I think I cut that out quite a long time ago. Fish is quite a nice fruit. I recommend that as a fruit. Kate is quite productive. But all of these are fun and worth growing. Here's some fruit I picked last week, left to right: Moran, Kate, and Leroy. Moran's a seedling of mine. Kate is a fruit from Alice Kate. You probably have heard of the Kate macadamia. That was Alice, Southern California, in the 70s. Those are decent sized fruit. Those are probably, how big is that ruler? I mean, those are at least 3 inches. And those are just sort of typical off the tree. I'm not like cheating and picking big ones for size. Leroy is an old California variety. I don't know. People hyped it up, and I'd never grown it or eaten it until relatively recently. And, now I'm fruiting it, and I think I'll probably move on to something else, honestly. This is a seedling of Bob Chambers. It's another one that looks like a recurve mango kind of, and it's strongly flavored. It tends to have a little bit of bitterness in the skin. For a while, I was distributing this wood as 5G6, but Bob decided before he passed away to call it Clecia. Some of you may remember our ex-fruit gardener editor. Fish is quite a nice fruit. Sean Hannon likes this fruit. We probably first ate it together a long time ago. Sean lives in San Francisco and has got a tree of it. For now, you know what? There's too many of these slides. I think I should probably move down. Oh, it is useful to spread the harvest. Fiesta is the latest white sapote that I know. It's also very small, but it's quite productive, but it makes a lot of fruit. They tend to be a little bit like ping pong balls, but it's useful to sort of spread the harvest out. What else have we got? Let's move on. Oh yeah, some are definitely more everbearing, and that's a useful thing. These all tend to be ostensibly more everbearing. Not true for me for Leroy, but it was people made that claim to me. Silk is interesting in that it'll do like kind of often 4 flower flushes a year, so it'll keep having waves of crops. It's not actually the tastiest fruit. I think Nettie is a better choice. Of these, I'm personally a fan of Nettie. All right, what's our next slide? Pike is a worthy fruit. It's quite an old variety. It's a very big fruit. It's not as big as McDill maybe, but it's quite big, and I think quite nice, and it's quite productive. So even like the old ones that some people think are like kind of bland, I think that's quite a nice fruit and worth growing, which basically, so McDill is one that's commercially available. It's probably after Subel the next most common one. It makes a big fruit. It can be, it's a decent fruit for sure. I don't think it's sort of at the top in terms of flavor, but it is big, and it can be quite productive, and it's a nice fruit, like most white sapotes. And so, you know, without the CRFG, it is true, all our endeavors would be fruitless. And I would just like to give a shout out to Bob Chambers. All of these varieties that generally folks are growing really are a result of work, I would argue, by Bob Chambers. You know, people like Reineke or Engelhardt or some of these older CRFG pioneers, especially Paul Thompson, actually collected a lot of these varieties, found the seedling trees and named them. But it was Bob who really grew them, kept them alive, and distributed the wood around the world. And certainly, you know, around the CRFG. And so I really think that we all owe him kind of a big debt. So that's the end of my slides, and I will be happy to try to answer questions.
Oh, terrific. Thank you, Tom. That was a great presentation. I'm sure everyone is now wondering what scions we're going to find at the next exchange, which is pretty exciting to think about. Let's see, kind of scroll.
I remember exchanges. Will we have those again in the distant future?
We had quite a lively exchange this year. Our Monterey Bay chapter did a virtual exchange.
Nice.
And people signed up online, and then they came and collected their scion wood. It was great. It was well attended. I think.
Well done.
You know, I certainly had a lot of fun. I hope everybody else did.
Excellent.
So
okay,
it was good. So let's see
these questions. Where should we
start
up at the?
What varieties taste most like butterscotch or caramel?
Ones that are more strongly flavored. Things like Walton tend to, things like Rainbow tend to, often ones that are more deep yellow orange tend to. Lemon Gold, Reineke Commercial. Okay.
And
are they precocious?
Yeah, I don't know if that's referring to.
So the answer is. But... yeah, it really depends on the variety. Some want to fruit early. I mean, you know, I've had plenty of, you know, grafted ones that I'll graft in a small pot, and they'll fruit. And I always tell the people who take the tree away, pinch that fruit off, let your tree grow roots. So the answer is it depends. We talked a little bit about which were and which weren't. Are the complex sugars in the fruit effective probiotics? Are they only partially digestible? I can't answer that question. I don't think anybody's ever actually looked at that issue carefully. It's an area there, there's been some sort of, I've got some academic papers on this fruit and I've corresponded with some academics about it, but we don't really, I don't know. I'm going to have to pass, sorry. Do they do better with fertilizer? Well, it really depends on your soil, right? If you've got like completely barren soil with no nitrogen in it, no sort of organic content, no microflora, microfauna, they won't do as well as with better soil. Do I fertilize my trees? I'm a lazy guy. Yeah, when they're young, I'll put down like horse shit in volume or large quantities of coffee grounds. Alfalfa pellets are a nice sort of quick, easy thing to do. But the best thing is feed your soil tons of wood chips, just like everything else. So yeah, that's what I would say about fertilizer. Do you thin your fruits? I'm way too lazy to thin my fruits. Is it a good idea? It can be, I suppose. One nice thing about this species, it can hold huge fruit load. And it's not like, if you don't thin your peaches or your plums, like you're going to break branches, right? Not, have I ever had white sapotes break? They're incredibly tough. So you don't have to thin nearly as much as you do many other things. I never thin, but I am a lazy guy. Netius precocious, yep, I agree with that. I was saying that. When is the best time of year to transplant? I'm in a high heat area. These trees are a lousy tree to transplant. You can do it, but it's not an easy thing to do, and it's not always a smart thing to do. I think you might be better off starting over. They've got a big taproot. It's hard to get them.
So if you had started your seed in a pot, for example, okay, my little seeds are in pots. They're in, I don't know, quart size pots, and they're going to grow.
Size pots?
Quart, I would say.
Yeah.
To see if they would germinate, right? And then I'm probably going to move them up to gallon size, and then move them up to, I don't know, 5 gallon before I decide where to put them in the garden. Is that safe to do, or are you suggesting that, okay, you're looking pretty aghast, do not go there? Okay.
Here's what I do instead, right? When I sell a lot of these plants to people, and my strategy is to give people a smaller plant in a big, deep root trainer pot. So what I do is, by the time the sapote pops through the surface of the dirt, usually the root at that point is about 8 inches long.
Whoa.
So if you're putting it in a little pot, like a 1 gallon or something, like bad idea. So instead, get some root trainer pots, or do this, like the dirt bag kind of strategy is take two 1.5 gallon wax paper cartons, put them on top of each other, stack them. So there's a nice deep, pot, and start them in that and get them in the ground sooner rather than later. If your tree has been in a 5 gallon pot, like the nursery trees, invariably when you pull that tree out, you'll see what a mess the roots are. And, there are some ways you can deal with that the same way you deal with planting anything else with root bound roots, like blast it with a hose, expose the roots, try to spread them out. But the roots are fragile and you'll break a lot of roots. It's much harder to do that with sapotes than it is, say, with like myrobalan plum, stuff grafted onto myrobalan or other sort of tougher roots. So you're much better off. Ideally, you would have put a seed in the ground 20 years ago. You can put a seed in the ground today, or you can buy a small plant and put it in the ground, one that is in a nice deep pot. Hope that helps. And I don't have a lot of time, yikes. So we're gonna go through these quick.
Okay, so we're wondering how does
My contact info is at the start of that slideshow, by the way. My email is elcerritotom@yahoo.com. It was right, it was on the first page of the slides. I have 8 white sapote. There was some, hold on. What are some typical weights of popular varieties? 8 ounces is a decent size, but there is no typical weight. One thing about white sapotes is, like, you know, McDill, a huge fruited white sapote, will have ripe at the same time things the size of a golf ball and, like, you know, 4-inch behemoths. So they vary a lot. Bigger varieties include McDill, Pike, Walton, Moran. But yeah, they vary quite a bit. How do I go up here?
So
Oh,
the next question, I think, is how does the new Delta Gold variety that Harvey introduced stack up?
I think I ate it at Harvey's place once. I'm sure it's a fabulous fruit. What are the attributes of Golden Globe? Golden Globe is pretty heavy bearing. It's a round fruit. It's decent flavor. You know, I'm not wild about Golden Globe. Is the Ross worth growing? Is that the Ross Sapote? If it is, we're talking about a botanically very different plant. I don't know a Ross white sapote variety. So I think Ross sapote is basically a green sapote. I actually grow green sapote, which is kind of a weird thing to grow and fruit in Northern California. I like green sapote, but and I think Ross sapote is similar. How do I get in touch with you to buy your grafted trees? Just send me an email. I have a Vernon, didn't do anything for 3 months. Then it dropped all its leaves and exploded with, oh my God, it exploded, help. Will it do the same thing when I put it in the ground? If it's not in the ground, yeah, yikes, get it in the ground sooner rather than later. Hard to say what it'll do. I mean, I could like lie and tell you I know exactly what it will do, but I really shouldn't. I could come up with all sorts of predictions. If it dropped its leaves, it was stressed, right? We went through what stresses them: cold, heat, drought. My largest fruit thus far has been 8 ounces. Oh, I did, sorry, I've already seen that. I'm jumping around. Yikes. I'm gonna go down another question. I have 8 white sapote in a small yard. I hope that means trees, but might mean fruit. I cannot put in another sapote tree. Is it possible to get cyanwood from you? Sure, yeah, absolutely. You can totally multi-graft these trees. I have trees that are basically germplasm repositories, you know, where I have lots of different varieties grafted onto them.
And I think you mentioned, Tom, that you can graft these trees virtually any month of the year. Is that correct?
I definitely have. Now, that being said, it's just like grafting anything else. You want your rootstock to be flushing hard, and you want to have good cyanwood. So the most important thing is flushing rootstock. You know, in general, the spring flush on everything tends to be the biggest. But if you pay attention to your trees, you'll see them flushing more than just the spring a year, especially if they're happy. They might do 4 flushes a year. So is there any way to get more upright growth on a tree that is growing like an umbrella? It's hard. They naturally want to be an umbrella. We talked about that. The gophers bother the roots. These are not figs. They're not gopher candy. That's the good news. Gophers will eat them, but once the tree is big enough, they're pretty tough. I mean, I've seen these trees, like people growing like where they're like, I don't know if they you know, maybe they want to let the gophers live in harmony with the gophers. So they're not bad. They're easier than some things with gophers. Can you get away with rooted cuttings and growing to maturity? You can, but good luck. You'll need like pretty darn sophisticated propagation techniques and setup. Hard to do. Way better to plant a seedling and graft onto it. Much better root structure in the long run. When is the right time to pick the fruit? Molly asked. Molly, it's when you're hungry. Well, okay, so how do we know when fruit is ripe? Depends on the variety. Look for a color change. Look for like glossy going to matte. You know how avocados like glossy go to matte, like think of paint sheens. But most importantly, touch it lightly. Touch the shoulders of the fruit, like with your thumb. Is it starting to get ripe? Is it hard as a rock? Take the fruit in the palm of your hand and rock it a little bit. And if the stem comes off at the fruit insertion point, okay, that fruit is going to ripen really well and it's pretty darn good and ripe. If the stem snaps at the abscission point, like if this is like, you know, the little abscission point like you see on pears or other things, that also will ripen pretty well. You can pick them hard and let them ripen on the counter, but the fruit will not be as tasty generally as picked tree ripe. Yeah, that's an important thing. And we can all share the information. Okay, Margaret has one. Let's see what Margaret says. Margaret, our fearless leader for many years. Thank you for your service, Margaret. Do you suggest grafting onto a full-grown tree or one of the younger ones? Graft onto what you've got. You know, I always think that if you've got a big tree of any sort and you don't like the variety, or it was a seedling and it never fruited, or it's got, for whatever reason, or you just want to have like diversity is fun, right? Life is more fun in a diverse world. So put some other stuff on it. A bigger tree is a bigger root system. So it has the potential to, you know, get more fruit more quickly on a big old root system. All right, do you suggest grafting? Sorry, I'm coming down. Aeroponic propagation setup. I haven't done that. They're pretty darn hard to root. Doesn't mean that you can't do it, but it's not easy. You know, people have pretty sophisticated home setups these days as a result of I would argue the cannabis industry has made such setups widely available to people. But honestly, I just think you're better off doing a tree from a seed. It's going to have a better root system, unless you like watering a lot. But you know, it's nice to have a nice deep taproot. I've got 8. 3 are smaller, 3 are large, and others are smaller. Yeah, very typical, right? They vary in size.
The grafting onto the full grown.
Oh, do you graft onto a full-grown tree or one of the younger trees? Yeah, you could do either one. How does green sapote do for you? Green sapote is like, that's a super unlikely fruit to grow in Northern California, right? That's Sapote viridis. That's a different species. It's the Sapotaceae. I really like the flavor. I've probably had it fruiting for close to 20 years, but that's not something, you know, if you're a normal person, don't grow that, right? That's like, for a long time, I think that was the
person who's asking the question is not a normal person, if you don't mind my saying that, Nate. Nate is a nursery person as well and does a lot of very interesting stuff. So maybe you two need to have a separate discussion on that.
Okay, yeah, reach out to me and I'll tell you what I think. What are my thoughts on 4H4? I like 4H4. That's one that was not being distributed. It's like Walton, right? It's one of those ones that I got keen on and started distributing. It's a good fruit. It's totally worth growing. And I probably haven't evangelized that as heavily as Walton because I don't think it's like that good, but it's quite good and really worth growing.
All right, folks,
Okay,
I
head
think
to
that
Grafting, you recommend.
I think we've reached the time point at which Tom needs to get off on his bicycling adventure to the Sierra Nevada. So if there are other questions, no worries. Please do send them to me and I will compile everything, send them on to Tom. He can reply back and then we'll distribute that to everyone. So whatever the questions were, everybody will get the benefit from. So
And
everybody,
one last important thing, Carol.
yes.
People will have lots of questions. This is
Ah.
so stupid. I can't help myself. But there is only one answer. Life is too short to grow boring fruit.
Bingo. I like that. That should be everyone's motto. So folks, let's give a nice round of applause to Tom, please. Thank you very much, Tom, for your presentation this evening, for taking the time with us. Also, thank you to Celine, who is his techno wizard and was helping to drive the presentation this evening. We really appreciate your time. Folks, if you want to hang on and chat a little bit, we can do that. Otherwise, Tom, again, safe driving, safe bicycling. We thank you for your time.